Friends, I want you to imagine that you're walking down the street in your hometown when you run into a familiar figure, the Count. He's a vampire, of course, and he offers you a decision. He can make you a vampire as well, but this is going to be irreversible. So you'll have to think about whether you want to do this or not. And of course, once you're a vampire, all sorts of changes will take place. You'll have to avoid sunlight. You'll have to feed on the blood of the innocent. All the usual changes that you're familiar with. I don't have to list them out. Now, the question is, should you do it? And I want you to take this goofy example a little seriously for the moment, because it's the first example used in this book called Transformative Experience by philosopher L.A. Paul from 2014. And I think it's a useful thought experiment, and we'll see that it's actually quite a practical question when you strip away the absurdity of it. We're going to make some assumptions, baseline assumptions. The first is that you are a deliberate and rational person. You're not just going to flip a coin to make this transformative decision. The problem, though, is that you don't know how you or your preferences will radically change in the process. And these two assumptions sort of bump up against each other, and that creates the dilemma in front of us. So one thing that you might decide to do is simulate in your head what it could be like to be a vampire. But even if you dress up like a vampire with your Halloween costume and glide around at night, it won't really be the same thing. That's kind of part of the assumption as well. There are certain things about being a vampire that will just be hard for you even to imagine just because you're not one. So just imagining it, we're going to say, is also not sufficient for this example. Then you might decide to interview a vampire. This has already been discussed in the movie Interview with the Vampire. But you might go try to find friends who are vampires, ask them what it's like. Do they like it? Would they recommend it? So on and so forth. You get your anecdotal evidence. This is also a little suspect. You might wonder if there's something about becoming a vampire that makes vampires, like being such. It's hard to take this evidence completely on face value as well. Maybe vampires don't even like humans. Maybe they just want to trick you into becoming one of them. That's also a possibility. So this is not the best evidence to have. Finally, you might consider if there's some science, some objective reporting on what it's like. Are vampires objectively happier after being transformed? Maybe with this third-person perspective, you can get rid of the biases and prejudices of getting data from your friends and make a more clear-headed decision. But there's also a problem in this, which is that you are kind of taking your own personal preferences about the situation out of play. You're going to hope that there's something obvious about whether or not to make this decision based on the science. But it might turn out that you don't even like blood. So after doing this, your whole life might be miserable because you'll never have a good meal for the rest of your life. So just to sum up, the basic problem is that here you are on the left with your human point of view and your current values. And after this transformation, you'll have a vampire point of view with different values. And I've drawn this line in the middle to show that there's some kind of epistemic block. You can't access what it's like to be a vampire. Okay, so we've used this admittedly somewhat silly example in order to make the point clearer. There are actual examples that are quite similar to what we have here. One would be, for example, getting married or having a child. Those are such examples where afterward it might be very different than before in such a way that you couldn't have predicted what it would be like. Another example that I've recently come to learn about is that in the deaf community, there's a big discussion about getting cochlear implants, so then regaining the ability to hear. But if you do this, then you'll be less connected to the deaf community, which is very tight-knit. So this is actually a question that many people have to think about in that community, about whether or not to regain their senses. But the most common one, and the one that I feel most equipped to comment on, would be something like picking a career. And in fact, I've had some conversations with people about this topic. And in one of them, I realized that the person that I was talking to was thinking a lot about the specific choice of two companies to go between. And from my perspective, it seemed like she was overly fixated on the specific details of that decision. It would have been fine either way. But of course, that's easy for me to say from the outside. I'm not the one who's undergoing this transformation. So on the topic of marriage, I'll bring in a guest speaker for a, oh, is this video gonna play? Okay. Tell me if the audio doesn't work.
I got married late in life. I was 45. I had some issues. Was enjoying those issues quite a bit, as I recall. When I was single, I had married friends. I would not visit their homes. I found their lives to be pathetic and depressing. Now that I'm married, I have no single friends. I find their lives to be meaningless and trivial experiences. In both cases, I believe I was correct. Whichever side of marriage you're on, you don't get what the other people are doing.
Whichever side of marriage you are on, you don't get what the other people are doing. And even though this is a joke, I think there's some kernel of truth to this in this example and the others that we've just mentioned. So it is a serious problem that a lot of people have to think about in big life choices. And that's why it's worth thinking about. Why reflect on so difficult a question? It would be really easy to go back to trying to find the objective signs here. You might imagine if the question of having a child is really bearing on you, you might try to find out if parents are statistically more happy. But that would be like, taking, as I said earlier, taking your own personal point of view out of the equation. And you might have preferences that need to be taken into account. And your own experience might be different than the statistical average. So that's a strategy that I've heard other people mention, but I'm not sure that it's the right strategy to use here. Now, L.A. Paul actually has some advice on this pretty difficult question, which is meant to get you thinking more than it is to answer all your concerns. And the first step is to go back to what would it be like? That was the question that got us started. What would it be like to be a vampire? And then from that point, you have to ask the question, do you want to find out? So it's not a matter of whether being a vampire is better than not being a vampire, but more about, do you want to know the kind of person that you'll become, since those experiences are not available to you? So unfortunately, I can't solve the problem that I've presented to you, but this is a question that I think anyone can reflect on when they're having one of these transformative experiences at the doorstep. Just ask whether you want to find out.